Good evening, everyone. My name is Anatoly Alexienko. I'm professor of international higher education at the Education University of Hong Kong. This evening, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome two of my colleagues in the field of higher education, distinguished scholars and practitioners of higher education, policy development. I'm happy to welcome here Professor Glen Jones, who is currently holding the Ontario Research Chair on Post-Secondary Policy and Measurement. He was the Dean of Ontario Institute of Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. He was also the president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Higher Education, as well as the editor of the Canadian Journal of Higher Education. Also, I have a colleague from Poland, Professor Dominik Antonowicz, who is a university professor at the Department of Science and Higher Education Research at the Institute of Sociology in the Faculty of Philosophy and Social Sciences at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun, in Poland. And Dominik is known in the country as one of the experts on university governing boards. And that's probably where the story began, because as far as I know, Dominik had a chance to travel to Canada, work with Professor Jones, and both of them has recently published an interesting volume which describes experiences or provides insights into how university governing boards work in Canada. But also in tonight's talk, they will also draw some parallels with experiences in Europe. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Jones to start with this conversation, and then we will have opportunities to ask questions and comments. So Professor Jones.
Thank you very much, Anatoly. And let me first thank the Education University of Hong Kong for providing this opportunity. And I want to thank you, especially Anatoly, for your leadership in this. And I know that you're very actively working to create a new program and a new center at the Education University. And my congratulations. These are big accomplishments in the scholarship of higher education. And my thanks very much for bringing us together to facilitate a conversation about governing boards in Canadian higher education. So as you began, Dominik and I have just recently published a book, and I'll just move to the next slide. And this is a book on the role of university governing boards in Canadian higher education. This book comes from a long series of conversations that Dominik and I have had over the last almost 3 years now. And I think it's become an interesting kind of project, and it has a lot to sort of offer for those who have a particular interest in governance, and specifically for those who are interested in trying to locate governance within broader sort of social constructs within higher education systems. Can move on to the next slide then, please. So this is our agenda. I'm going to say from this morning, because it's 8 o'clock here, and I recognize there are some time differences in different parts of the world here. We're going to talk a little bit about our sort of origin story, and that is, how did we get started with this? And the importance of the sort of multidisciplinary conversation that took place. We're going to talk about the major aims of the study, what we were trying to accomplish, talk a little bit about our methodology. We'll provide an overview of the development of university governance in Canada, which is somewhat distinctive. It relates very much to some of the other Anglo-Saxon systems, but it has some very distinctive elements. Talk about the jurisdiction of governing boards. And I think we'll conclude by talking about what we've learned in terms of the major contributions of governing boards. It's a big project and a big book, but we've sort of made some selective decisions in terms of what to include in this presentation, with the notion of trying to introduce people to the Canadian context and to the sort of history and development of boards in the Canadian context. Next slide then, please. So as you indicated, Anatoly, Dominik, we had the pleasure of hosting Dominik at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education beginning in 2020. We'd had a number of interactions before. We had some mutual colleagues, and we began to have a series of conversations. And of course, this is in the middle of the most serious of the COVID lockdowns. So he may be in the same city, but we're having long conversations over Zoom. And we began to actually have a quite fascinating series of conversations. It began with a kind of general discussions of university governance and quickly switched to be about university boards. And it's a kind of cross-cultural, multidisciplinary conversation. Dominik has tremendous expertise in terms of the European context, and of course, especially with governance reforms within Poland. I spent my life trying to understand Canadian higher education. Dominik is a sociologist. My background is in political science. So the conversations were really quite fascinating. And even for someone who spends a lot of time trying to understand university governance in Canada, the questions that Dominik were asking were quite fascinating because they essentially challenged some of the ways in which I was looking at this topic and raised questions and new approaches that hadn't occurred to me before. So it was, I think part of the whole story here is about these really interesting conversations that took place and have continued to take place. What are the aims of the study that we began to look at? We talked about the concept of governing boards as part of the broader idea of Canadian universities. In fact, we try and locate governing boards within the broader social context of Canadian higher education. And we wanted to analyze the organizational structure and composition of university boards. We wanted to understand the role of governors within the bicameral governance model, and with a particular interest, I think, in lay members. This is an issue of some considerable interest in Europe, where lay members of governing boards are a relatively new phenomenon. They've had a long history in Canada, but perhaps because of that long history, they haven't been explored and analyzed in the same kind of way because they've been part of the normal processes within that system. Move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of methodology, we did a tremendous amount of data collection, or more precisely, Dominik did a tremendous amount of data collection. And we really were trying to develop data sets and data systems so that we could at least triangulate many of the various elements of this. So we included on the qualitative side, individual in-depth interviews with quite a number of people. There was text analysis because we were looking at all kinds of materials, participatory observations and sort of case studies. And on the quantitative side, we involved survey and analysis of board composition. So in terms of what we obtained, we conducted analysis of provincial regulations and university charters and statutes, remembering that this is a provincial system, so the provinces really matter in terms of providing the foundation for governance. We analyzed all the bylaws, university boards, and the standing committee structures, individual profiles of board members based on publicly available information, either on university websites or by digging up that information from other websites. We did an online survey of university board members to get some sense of their perceptions of these activities. We did participatory observation of board meetings. This was particularly interesting in the context of COVID because while many of the universities had open meetings, that many of them now broadcasted it during the context of COVID. So there was a unique opportunity to actually participate and listen in on these meetings that were taking place. We did quite a number of interviews with governing board professionals. And finally, we did some expert interviews with former board chairs. On to the next slide then, please. Governing boards is becoming an increasingly important topic in the study of higher education, and certainly within the narrower research on governance itself. A lot of interest in governing boards, in part because of the transformations that are taking place in many parts of the world, where boards are a relatively new ingredient, or at least they've been reformed in the context of sort of neoliberal reforms or broader system-level reforms. So there's a whole notion of kind of new or modernized bodies of university governance, often with a particular influence or impact in terms of lay members, and the idea of those external to the universities playing increasing roles in this. There's the notion of bridges between society and the university, and others, to what extent do boards, especially those that are composed of lay members, really provide a bridge and linkage in the governance processes of the university to the broader society. And of course, the notion of boards as carriers of the new public management script. In other words, they are embedded within a notion of new public management, and they bring those concepts and ideas into the university in ways that perhaps had not been true before. So there's been a fair bit of interest in the notion of governing boards as a shifting arrangement within university governance, but we would argue that most of that work has been sort of framed by basic structural functionalism. So there's been a common notion of a common function of a common emphasis on structure and on a structural perspective in terms of analyzing these bodies rather than looking at them in a broader context and rather than positioning them within the broader society and the interactions of governance. So we move on to the next slide, please. So we also, a key element of this is also to recognize the increasing complexity of the university as an organization. The notion of a university as a complete organization is emerging as an interesting topic of discussion in a number of systems. In many respects, that concept has been embedded in higher education in Canada for quite some time. But the notion of just incredible complexity as we understand universities, and of course, that complexity has bearing in terms of governance. So we talk about the growth of knowledge, increasing specialization of programs, of research facilities, growth in operational activities, supporting the expanding mission in terms of real estate, capital construction, human resources, increasing external relationships, which everyone knows are taking place in terms of industry and international relationships, increasing increasing responsibilities and issues of mental health. So the university itself is engaged in many more activities, and the complexity of what it's doing, and therefore the complexity of how one governs the institution and how one considers the role of the governing board becomes extremely important. Next slide, please. So in order to appreciate some of this, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the development of governing boards in Canadian higher education as a sort of foundational starting point. It is important to remember that Canada is a federation, and that is the provinces play the central regulatory role. There are different provinces, and the provinces have different accountability and other mechanisms relating to the university sector. One of the early questions that emerged within Canadian higher education was the question of what should the relationship be between these public universities that were beginning to emerge and the state. And there were a number of different models, a lot of experimentation, some dramatic failures. And in 1906, the University of Toronto was the subject of a royal commission by the Ontario government with the idea of trying to understand and provide recommendations on what the governance structure of this university might be in terms of its relationship to what was then the province of Ontario. And this became known as the Flavel Commission. And out of that came a series of ideas that were not necessarily new, but very clearly articulated, and therefore had a lot of implications across Canada in terms of influence in other institutions, in terms of governance structures. They really made three kinds of recommendations. One is, in order to avoid partisan political interference, they suggested that the responsibilities of the state be delegated to a governing board. The notion was that there had been political interference, the partisan politics of the province was getting in the way, and so therefore it's important to delegate that responsibility to a governing board, which would be distinct from government and which would separate the university from partisan influences. The second is they argued for the importance of retaining the Senate. So they argued for a bicameral structure that was actually embedded in legislation. So both the board and the Senate would be part of the legislation of the university. And third, they believed in the importance of a strong president. So they positioned, even in 1906, they positioned the president as the chief executive officer of the university. And those three principles, the notion of bicameralism, the notion of delegating authority to the board, and the notion of a strong president, became quickly embedded, I think, in university governance, especially amongst public universities, especially amongst new universities that were emerging in Western Canada. That's the foundational structure. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, we have a period of democratization that takes place. And you have the notion of increasing internal representation on these bodies. So you have, in most situations, you have faculty members on boards as well as lay members. You have student members on boards as well as lay members. You have a significant number of student members on university senates, and you expand the university senate to include junior as well as senior faculty. So you have an expansion of participation within these arrangements. And all of this is taking place in a context where every university has its own act, with some exceptions. There are two provinces that have omnibus legislation. But for the most part, each of the acts creates a somewhat similar kind of governance structure. There are some unique arrangements, but the notion is that they are idiosyncratic to the institution based on history and arrangements, but they contain many of these same sort of common principles. And that's the sort of foundational development of university governing boards in Canada. And I'll turn it over now to Dominik.
Thank you, Glenn, for the rich introduction and your thoughts. Yes, that was the foundation of the university governance that is essentially in the center, or has been in the center of our study. As you can see on the slides, in a very simplistic way, there is a bicameral model. On one side, we have the university board responsible for, to make it simple, external affairs and performing the overseeing and supporting role for the president, as well as electing or selecting and appointing the president. And the other side, we have a university senate with the, you can call it an internal role. So essentially the research and education, the foundation for the university has been in the hands of Senate, although the financial decisions, the links with the province, the links with the external environment that includes funders, donors, and different public/private agencies that supports financially the university is in the hands of university board. So in the middle of it is that increasingly less popular and increasing more failing role of the president. The number of the presidents that actually stepped down in Canada has been increasing in the last couple of, 5-10 years, which is a kind of worrisome signal. And now the dispute is growing about why it's happening. But nevertheless, this is the bicameral model, and the president probably should be a little bit less in a circle, performing the role of CEO or executive role. And only adding to what Glenn was talking about, the increasing complexity of university as organization, the increasing complexity actually put more weight on the university board because of different type of donors. I mean, say politically involved, sometimes suspicious money, sometimes shadowing money. Also, the money that entails kind of obligation on the university side, not always clear. Different agencies have different rules for funding grants or bigger projects, public-private projects, the transformation of the ownership of certain type of technology becomes a politically sensitive, but also commercially risky. So with the growing risk, the growing involvement of the university into relying the university on the external environments, external actors, most of whom have a completely different rules, operate in a different political and also economic environment, that puts more pressure on the university board to actually exercise the overseeing role. So, before we, get into the details about what are the university boards, just let me introduce you into the, very basic facts and figures to give you a sense of what we are talking about. Okay, we're talking about a collective body, and this collective body structure and its composition is stipulated by the university acts or charters, with an exception of 2 provinces, as Glenn mentioned before. I mean, but it's usually the charter or the law or provincial law in some cases only sketch the major framework. The details lies in the bylaws, very often very stable bylaws, but still each university have a very different detailed regulation about the type of membership, type of appointment, length of terms, and many other things like structure of the standing committees that also have been a subject of our empirical investigation. So the average is probably not a good measure. Most of you know that's the mean is not a good measure. The body is about 24 members, so it's a large body, but it's not a big council. It meets the body meets, the university boards meets approximately 8 times a year for the plenary session. And those plenary sessions during the extremely difficult, but also extremely challenging times for our study were broadcasted on the YouTube, either on live or with some delay. But they gave me especially opportunity because Glen was member of the board already, so he knew he had a experience working on the board. But I could compare with my experience working on the Polish boards. But also having access to work on different, to view different boards across Canada, and they have a very different habits, different rules. But overall, there is some kind of board house rules which are very, very similar. So it's a 24 members. That it could be very small board, like 12 members or 13 members, but also could be a big board like University of Toronto, which has a unicameral model, a little bit different with about 50 members. So the board members can be appointed, by the province or mostly by the province, by the premier of the province, elected or elected by for example, alumni associations, but also faculty councils and different actors within the university, also those outside university, if they represent some kind of minority group, like a francophobic community, or could be two-folded. So they are elected, but they are formally appointed by somebody else, which is usually the very formal process. So there is I would say there is a great diversity or wide spectrum of election / selection process, but those three, dominates across Canada. Typically, the term in office is a 3-year, often with opportunity for reappointment. What is interesting, there are a few boards that have a opportunity to co-opt additional members if there is some kind of skills or knowledge particularly needed for the board. It's interesting how the boards communicate they need of skills and knowledge. They use a tool which is called a skill matrix. So the board was, in fact, university, but it's with the work with the board. University sends this skill matrix with, indicated what kind of skill the boards possess, what kind of knowledge and experience it does to the province, communicated what it needs, what kind of skill it lacks, what kind of profile of members it would require to function effectively. And of course, that's a little bit of politics. Boards that the province don't always follow the request of the university, but overall, the province doesn't go against it. So they use that matrix to appoint new members to make sure that the board has what it takes to perform overseeing role on behalf of the society of the province of Canadians. So to make a long story short, what's the jurisdiction of the boards, what the boards do, and there is I think, great deal of consistency from Atlantic provinces to British Columbia. So overall, it's strategic management. So the board sets the mission, vision, and underpinning values of the university. They express the interest, will of the province, what the society expects from university to do, to deliver in terms of very abstract blue sky ideas, but still it's important the accents they put. Well, it's more important, what's less. They have strategic documents, and those strategic documents been approved by the board. Of course, in a practical terms, I would say appointing university leadership is the most important single thing that the board is responsible for. But it's not only about appointing, it's about searching, appointing, supporting, and making the university leadership, rector, accountable. And that's a long process. Here, appoint university leadership isn't just a phrase that represents entire process that covers the work of the board with the president. It could be a rocky, could be bumpy road, could be smooth, but as I mentioned earlier, there is a growing problem, emerging issue of failing university presidency, and it's been very different reasons: too high expectations, turbulent times, but also the board sometimes a little bit try to micromanage. And although our research shows, and because we have a little of time, just that most of the boards keep their nose closed but the fingers out, and this is the policy they try to maintain. Human resources, so they have to approve appointments, but also promotions. But in most cases, that's the rules. The appointments, especially tenure, they have to agree because it entails financial consequences for the university. But it covers broader issue of the staffing policy, which board itself does not propose, it only approves, and it approves only because it has a severe financial consequences for the institutions. We have a spectacular failures, not many, but very spectacular, but also universities that do reasonably well. But Canada in the recent years also experienced some strikes among staff, so there's been quite an issue in higher education in Canada overall. Budgetary policy, understandably, that's the most crucial issue. Approves budgets and oversee budget, how it's been constructed, how the revenue is coming in and spending coming out. All those stuff is in the hands of university boards. We'll come back to who sits on the board, because that probably explain you why it's so important. Property management. Glen mentioned the university becomes an increasingly more complex organization with a huge land property development plans, very often the biggest employees and the biggest institutions and in the cities. So it's security and all that kind of issues are in the hands of the university. Property management is in the center of that. For some European university, it's not an issue because it's effectively like in Finland, the state owns the land and the university only administrate it or rent it or lease it from the state. But here is the property of the university, and it's a huge part of the budget, especially for those university who owns hospitals or manages the hospitals. And for students, the most important, but not for the students, but for the students is the most important thing. Establishing fees and charges for tuition fees or other services. Very key is a different part, is a kind of part of budgetary policy, but because the fees are such a politically sensitive topic almost everywhere, well applied, establishing fees is a discussion between the university, what the university expects in terms of revenues, and what students can afford. It's a political discussion, but also it's a budgetary discussion, because the university has to be funded properly in order to be effective and meeting the goals has been set by the boards. So every time, and I think Glen can share that opinion even because he has good experience, when the fees arrives on the table, the students tries to protect, obviously represent the students' community, but there are also other arguments in play. So this is one of it's not a big issue in terms of the time the board spent, but clearly the most sensitive issue in terms of the impact on the students' community and future students, obviously. And the last one, very specific for the North America, is the pension plans. I mean, it's a big chunk of money that the university has and invests the money of employees and the future pensioners, and it's huge in terms of the amount of money. It's in a great interest of those whose money isn't there, but obviously it's very North American. But again, board, because of the financial scandals everywhere else, pays especially in a banking sector, pays special attention. So the size of the boards, as I said, the average is not really the perfect measure for, almost anything. So, but you can see that 38% of the boards are 19 or less, 2029, 35%, so a little bit more than 1/3 is between 20 and 29, and at 20 to 27% is 30 or more members. You can see that the different, they are quite, almost 1/3 each of the cohort, but they are different types of the boards, and it has to be clearly acknowledged that there are some diversity in terms of structure, but in terms of the size, the boards are not that far away, but still there are different types of boards. Also because the local political climate could be very different, and some of them are bigger, more council-alike, and some of them are more executive-alike in terms of the size. But the powers are quite similar. So who are the board members, and what they can possibly bring to the university? That's a very interesting question. We want to go beyond the structure. So actually, we look at the structure of the composition of the boards, because that's been discussed everywhere. The balance. You can remember that Glen introduced the structural changes and brought it. So the lay members or alumni or external members, whatever you like to call, make about 2/3 of the cohort. They are senior administrators or ex-officio, rectors or vice rectors, and they make about 10% of the board. No, they don't sit on every board, but the most boards, the director as a representations of different kind of administrators work to pass the information, the decision further. Students make the 11, more or less 11% of the board members, and employees, faculty and staff, about 1/5, 70%. Also, very often the employees have been the jurisdictions of each member has been assigned particularly to the campus, the type of employment or category of employees the particular individual represents. So it's not general employees representation, but they represent, or they have been elected. They maybe represent university, but they have been elected by a particular group of employees, sometimes representing the council, the particular department or faculty or a group of employees. So we look at all the, I think, 800 external members, trying to find what can they bring in terms of expertise. They can bring, obviously, the assets they can bring. It's broader than only their professional expertise. Before I come into the details, I just like to pay attention that the one big characteristic is that they are professional. They are leaders. They're both members leaders. They are leaders in their respected fields, whether they're professional leaders, they are community leaders. They are leaders. They are exceptional individuals, and obviously they bring that exceptionality into the board. They're often experienced. Board membership is also voluntary. I think we didn't mention that, but it's a significant feature of the boards in Canada. They are volunteers. Sometimes they get a library card. Sometimes they can have a university course for free, but or traveling costs covered. but they are volunteers. And the reason why they are volunteers, they either very active members, they want to enrich their portfolio, or they build their portfolio, or they are retired in terms of the accomplished professionals. They are retired alumni that want to bring something to, or return something to university. They get their education. But if you look at what they bring in terms of the professional experience, I think 1/5 of them have experience, or they actually work in the sector which covers finance, insurance, or real estate. So literally, that's where the main authority of the board sits. It's business administration, so executives in different type of organizations, and the 1/5, or 10%, so 1/10 is the members of the community-based organizations, including churches, all sorts of stuff. Then legal services, public administration, education, and so on. So those are, professional backgrounds of the board members. I spent quite of time trying to get in, because they are exceptional individuals with it's very relatively easy to track them through their either professional social media, or where the university themselves present who their board members are, where they come from, what their professional background, and so on. They very often, have a different work experience, but methodologically, I count the sector that they are actually in, and the portfolio of internal board members. What do you think they are? The social sciences. I didn't find it interesting. Didn't find it surprising, but because they are, I think, in a way, trained to be active in society. But we have with Glen a discussion about how surprising it is. But you can see they are, the composition of them is quite well balanced. Okay. Finally, what's the board contribution? Because that's probably the question I asked myself before I arrived in Canada. And we did lots of interviews with the board members, with the board secretaries, those people who actually manage the board, or try to make sure that they do not cross each other paths between different actors. So those senior administrators of the university who've been working for the boards, with the boards for quite some time, and we ask them very often what the board brings, what the board members and the board brings to the university, and that was unsurprising, but surprising at the same time. By bringing external perspective, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be present loudly. The fact that external members are sitting on the board makes the university leadership think differently. They have to consider that there are people outside university that actually care, and they are concerned about what's going on the campus. That perspective is sometimes missing in Europe, I would say, but it's a properly controversial statement. But those people from different aspects, different parts of society, different parts of the local community, they have a different sensitivity. They might point at the different issues. That's why how we understand bringing external perspective. It's sometimes university management sits too narrowly on the internal political games, who gets what. This is obviously one of the perspective, and very often becomes dominant with not necessarily makes the university any good. And the university is a part of a larger ecosystem when it communicates with the external actors. So that's why bringing external perspective is the major contribution that the board can offer to university, or good boards can offer to university. Hiring and supporting university president has been emerging and trending topic, because the failing presidency in the Canadian universities, it's a huge issue. It's not I think Glen can share that it's not as well paid as British universities, or even American. It's not even the kind of caucus of directors that are changing universities, but it's a difficult job, I must say. It's a challenging job in a challenging times, and increasingly challenging, I would say, with this, funding being the funding constraints. Also in Canada, the limits of of international students that they can educate. And this is the second. This is the second most important thing that the board can contribute. And the third one is oversight. We ask each of our interviews at the end of the interview to name one word that he or she associates with the board, like just one shot, not too many words, one word. And most of them, like a vast majority, overwhelming majority, would say oversight. So overseeing role is probably that's something that any other body within the university structure can actually offer and exercise, because of those individuals are so well established, so exceptional. So asking questions, looking into the numbers, pushing the vice chancellors or presidents to execute the policy it promised to do. It's probably the best the best way to do. And again, the last one, collective bargaining. We didn't really mention that all the academics in Canada are unionized. So the collective bargaining is important part of the managerial process of the work of the university. It's not about how much money each group is entitled to get, but also the size of autonomy, the promotion criteria, and probably in the discussion we would much better to tell it, but it's collective bargaining, and the board actually plays an important role to oversee president with this process, which not often, but sometimes, but it's always difficult process, which sometimes can be harsh for both sides. Okay, thank you very much. And that's probably would be the short summary which we can offer in the book, which we strongly obviously recommend you to read.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and thank you very much, Dominik. It's a really exciting presentation. I encourage everyone to get a book and probably read more details of the study, which looks quite sophisticated. I invite colleagues to ask questions. You can use the chat room, as I said, or feel free to raise your hand. I can see a question coming from Ben John Bloyd asking about whether it's a descriptive study, and did you have any hypothesis in mind about the power of boards or the impact of their composition on their work, or how they operate in different provinces, and how does the work of Canadian boards compare to boards in other countries? Can they fire the president like in the recent Harvard case, or was that a board of trustees? How would you respond to those questions?
Sorry, did you want me to respond? I mean, look, I think it's much more than I think it's much more than a descriptive study. I think that we began by framing this a little bit in the kind of reforms taking place in Europe, and that led, I think, to some assumptions and observations relating to the distinctive elements in the Canadian experience. And we also tried to frame this in a much broader conversation about the sort of social and educational foundations of Canada. So it really is trying to frame this in a much broader context and then link it to the most recent scholarship, especially in Europe, on some of the reforms taking place and the assumptions underscoring some of those reforms, but I think become challenged to some extent by the Canadian experience. You asked whether, yes, the boards can fire the president. I mean, the boards often appoint, often through a process that is much more collegial. In other words, they often have search committees that involve faculty and staff and students, broadly representative bodies that provide them with advice on the selection of a president. But then they are responsible for supervising that president. And it's not uncommon, as Dominik said, for the board to remove that individual, or in the niceties of the situation, for that individual to leave suddenly for family reasons. So there are removals because, and I think part of the removals and part of the point that Dominik was raising is about this increasing complexity, that as the university becomes increasingly complex, the responsibilities of the president become challenging, and the board has expectations that sometimes are not being met. And so you have tensions between the president and the board within this notion of a very complex organization, the notion of very complex governance and supervision responsibilities.
Thank you. I can see that more questions arrive, and I don't know, Dominik.
Yeah, I just like to briefly address the question of Glen. We didn't have a hypothesis, but we did have a research questions. I mean, the major is the questions were how the boards contribute to the university, and what way beyond the formal jurisdictions that we can read from the bylaws. So that's why we did interviews, trying to identify those, those things that I will show in the last slide that are not explicitly written in the bylaws or in other provinces, what they actually bring to the board and how they do that. And that, I would say, underpinning question that we have. We have a little bit more specific questions about transparency and so on, but I think that I'll leave the floor for the questions, and happy to send the book to
Yeah, I see a question from Christine Mosselin, and then Varduhi Gulazian and Julian Damkev and Giulio Barini. Christine, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. It was really very interesting. I had two questions. The first one is about the role of the board compared to the Senate, and how do they work together or not? So as you said, universities are very complex, and one part of this complexity is the fact that you have a Senate and a board. So did you look at that, and whether there is any link between the composition of the board and the kind of relationships they have to the Senate? And related to that, you said that you have representative of the university in some boards, but not all of them. Does it make a difference when you have representatives of the university on the board or not? Thank you very much.
Let me start, and then Dominik can follow up with what I've missed. It's important to recognize that these relationships are idiosyncratic, and so that there are separate acts and they are slightly distinctive. But yes, in most of the universities, there's both a board and a Senate. The responsibilities of the Senate are also relatively clearly demarcated within the legislation. So essentially, the legislation creates two bodies, but it also delegates authority to those two bodies. And in the case of the Senate, that authority is usually pretty clearly in the area of academic policy. So it's about academic programs and curriculum and standards of the institution. Did the two interact? The answer is yes, but perhaps not as much as they could. So you do have Senate members that may be, it's not uncommon for Senate members to be appointed to the board, and that becomes a mechanism. Clearly, the president of the university often chairs the Senate, as well as being a member of the board. You often have a series of governance professionals which administer both, and which play a role in facilitating communication between the two bodies. And you will sometimes even have social occasions and other opportunities for the two bodies to meet. So there is an attempt to maintain communication and a balance. I think that it would be, I think there are certainly people who are members of Senates who would say they don't have as much authority as they should have, and that most of the oversight responsibilities are in the hands of the board. But there is an attempt to create these two bodies and to maintain some clarity in terms of their relationships. I think almost all the boards have external members. I think the number that of them are, the number of internal members varies. But I think they almost all now have a faculty member and a student. Sometimes it's by tradition rather than by actual allocation of positions on the technical description of the board. But it's the most common scenario. And I think that the models where there isn't a member. The only ones I can think of are either for strange historical reasons or because we're starting to talk about the private sector, and our work is really focusing on the public sector. Have I missed anything, Dominik?
Yeah, I only just like to emphasize the role of the was biggest surprise for me. We interviewed the board secretaries, which I initially found. I mean, I initially thought that would be the kind of more small administrators, but in fact, they are individuals who try to facilitate those two boards to work together, or not cross each other paths, or make their cooperation most effective. And they are highly skilled professionals, all sometimes with their units with them. I mean, they are trained lawyers, and they make sure that these two bodies take use of each other effectively. They do not cross each other. They don't overstep over jurisdictions. And I think partly the success of the cooperation lies in those growing professionals, that their role within the organization is, I would say, it's massive. I mean, it's because there's 8 times plenary meetings. You have to make sure that those two bodies do not cross each other. They cooperate, they communicate with each other, and this is the link between them. And so they make the communication more effective. So if there was any discovery in the very beginning, I was surprised that the board secretaries are so important for the university as organization in Canada, and they facilitate the cooperation between these two boards. I think their role will be grow with the complexity of university.
Thank you. Varduhi Gulazin is asking about whether the boards have key performance indicators for the president or vice presidents. Is it the job of these boards, actually?
Yeah, I mean, the board certainly supervises the president, and in some cases there is some oversight of other senior administrators within the system. I think those relationships are idiosyncratic. Whether they are as specific as key performance indicators, I'm not sure. There are certainly, I think, conversations about expectations, and there may be conversations about empirical expectations in terms of revenues and other aspects of this. We can only talk about that in general terms because those agreements are not public. But when we talk to board chairs, I mean, that notion of that relationship being key, the board chair and sometimes a small committee that might provide very directive oversight or very specific oversight to the president. I mean, those are very key relationships. And if those relationships fail, then you've got a serious problem for the president. So I think another part of this is about the tremendous importance of that relationship between the board, and especially the board chair and perhaps the executive of the board and the president, both in terms of ensuring that there are common expectations of the performance of the institution, but also that those personal relationships are in good shape.
Right. Julian Demke is asking.
If I can, the board, which we find surprisingly, the board evaluates itself in very serious way. So it evaluates itself in terms of as a collective body, but also the chair of the board has annual meetings with each of the members to discuss one's contribution. And the board takes it the university boards take the role very seriously. And that was one of the surprises, I would say, surprising outcomes of the research. Thank you. Sorry.
Right. Julian Demke was asking about surprises. Did you have any kind of biggest surprises when you were doing this work? What was the most surprising part of the whole study for you, Dominik, probably, since you were coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I start with this one. I just give you 2 examples. I think the surprise it was the surprising was the discussion between us, and I think that I found it incredibly inspiring, but also in terms of the boards. I think I was under the impression that if the boards have an open meeting when you can broadcast it and you have a public allow to actually look or examine, witness the plenary session. It would work for the board. We were informed in several places that it stops board members to, I mean, the public eye, I mean, stops board members to make a bold statement, and they start to behave. They are more reserved. They don't take more radical steps, but more radical statements. They don't as sharp as they are when the public eye is not there. So they say it rather tempers the dynamics of the discussion, and the board secretaries, the professionals, would say it works against the board. It does not have as good effect on the president as if there wouldn't be a public eye. So I was 100% for the full transparency, but I was, just to kill the trust, the conspiracy of the board culture. But in many places, when we start to investigate, we get the reverse feedback, which was very surprised. And also the surprise was, as I mentioned earlier, the seriousness that the board take care of its own evaluation. So it expects itself to perform well, because their role, it's not a symbolic, it's a huge responsibility.
Glenn, for you?
I think for me, the biggest surprise was a number of the questions that Dominik asked. So I mean, I think that some of the elements of the board itself I was familiar with, that we've dealt with it in much more detail than I think that ever been done before. So I think there's so much new in the book. But a lot of the assumptions I had made, I think, were challenged by Dominik as we went through. So it was I think a lot of that sort of conversations between two people who look at this both as from an inside and an external perspective, and what that brought to me in terms of learning about the context in which I function was quite fascinating, I think.
Thank you. I see several questions from Giulio Marini, and I because we have limited time, I'll try to kind of reframe them probably by asking you to what extent the boards actually stay on the side of employees versus the side of employers. I mean, whose side they tend to take more in their decision making.
I think I mean, in legal corporate terms, they are the employer, right? So the board is the corporate university, and therefore it has collective bargaining, as Dominik said, collective bargaining is very common in the Canadian context. It's a heavily unionized sector. And unions are quite common in the Canadian context. Of course, there are regulations concerning unions, there are regulations concerning pensions. The government frames these discussions, but collective bargaining is very common. And of course, in the context of collective bargaining, it's the board which signs on behalf of the university. So these agreements are clearly negotiated by senior administrators under the framework that might be approved by the board. So the board have conversations. This is, and keep in mind that this isn't just about faculty. I mean, as Dominik said, the vast majority of Canadian faculty are unionized, but so are many other staff groups. So I work at a university with something like 20 different organizations, some of which unionized, some of which are not, relating to specific categories of employment. So this is a big and complex business. Different categories of employees, different bargaining units, different categories and opportunities, different employee, working conditions, and different salary structures. So collective bargaining, the board not in an operational sense as the board bargaining, but it has to think about this from an oversight business. It has to think about this in terms of the financial implications and how these pieces fit together. And the board is the one who essentially approves on behalf of the university all of these collective agreements. So I'm not trying to suggest that it is anti-employee, but it is very much positioned as management, and is very much positioned as the corporate university in its relationship with these who are essentially employees of the university. They're not employees of the public sector. They are university employees that the board has oversight of.
Yeah, I can see more questions in that. complex of questions Giulio asked, and I think that probably requires another kind of presentation on how these boards manage all these kind of pension plans and everything else, and to what extent, as Svetlana Shindarova asks about politics, in terms of to what extent they compare to other boards which may be political. And I see Jack Gone is also asking some methodological questions. But I would say that I would suggest that you send these questions to me, please. I can forward them to the presenters. Given this opportunity, I'll probably just give Glenn and Dominik a minute or two just sort of to conclude, in terms of maybe you would like to say something which you would like to say, either in regard to these questions which were asked, or regarding your own conclusions on the book.
Well, maybe I'll start for 30 seconds and Dominik can jump in. I mean, I found the project particularly fascinating, in part because because of the way in which we did it, it helped me challenge some of my basic ideas about the role of these boards. And I think the other thing I would point out is that if for those who are participating from Europe or from other jurisdictions, there are assumptions about boards which I think the Canadian experience raises questions about. In other words, the ways in which the critique of boards has emerged in some jurisdictions. I'm not trying to suggest that the Canadian boards represent a panacea, but they do, I think, represent a model or an approach in which there is a real value to the board, and it's contributing in multiple ways. There are challenges and there are perhaps critiques, but the boards actually participate in and play a very important role in governance in ways that I think are not often talked about in detail. So let me leave it at that. Dominik?
Just literally one sentence. I think the Canadian boards represent, I mean, Canadian university represents the idea of a public university, which are essential for the study, very European sense. But at the same time, they encapsulate the North American entrepreneurial spirit. And because of these two quite distinctive sets of values, the board has a special place and special role to marry it, to match it without harming the public mission of university, because there's a strong sense of public mission of the Canadian university, and we only look at the public university because it matters to us. But at the same time, they are organization in a kind of North American sense, like that they are organizations in that sense. I'll try to answer Jack who asked on the but I'll do it properly on the email, Jack. Thank you for the question, because we have no time then.
On that note,
I can see Svetlana as well. We try to get these questions afterwards. I mean,
right.
Directly.
Okay, thank you very much. On that note, let me just thank both Professor Glen Jones and Professor Dominik Antonowicz for this exciting event and for sharing their results. It's so important to learn about governance of universities, and in this particular super complex environment in which we are living in societies like Canada, we can learn a lot from them. So thanks again to you, and I look forward to seeing you soon at some of our other events and discussions, and have a nice evening or morning on your side. So thanks, everyone.